I should do that. Not so much from friends and family, but from coworkers and acquaintances. It's always been a somewhat awkward thing to hear, because I'm just living my life as best I can, and other people project some relative value onto my habits. Maybe the value they see comes from a perceived closeness between me and my friends and family. Maybe they want to receive a penned letter in the mail and haven't for months or years. I don't blame them there. It's a real rush to get a letter. Scientists who study the addictiveness of texting should take a second look at how good it feels to get a full written letter by someone you like. So good. The awkwardness doesn't come from the dissonance between my value of these activities and their value of these activities. I find relative value in writing letters instead of writing emails in casual situations, but clearly not everyone does, or they'd all have stationery sets in their desks. Yet, they see value when they see me writing. The awkwardness for me comes from the dissonance between their valuing of my choices and their guilty feeling about making different choices. It's like they see me and start to feel disappointed in themselves for making different choices, and, well, that's not something I want to make people feel. I've tried navigating this in different ways based on the situation, the person, and the nature of the comment. I've also changed my tack over time. Younger me might have heard, "Wow, you read a lot, that's incredible, I should really read more," and replied, "Yeah, well, it's fun and really opens the mind, and if you're thinking about reading more, you totally should." But time would go by, and my friends wouldn't read more, and they'd still feel the should when they saw me reading or posting about reading. And this got me thinking. My friends didn't actually want to read. They wanted to play video games and watch series on Netflix with their significant other. Nowadays, I'm more likely to say, yeah, I like reading, but there's no should. We all unwind in different ways. I like books and you like video games, and that's totally cool. And it is. For the record, I do play video games. I just play them like my friends read books, not as my primary source of recreation. This little journey of mine got me thinking, why am I put in the position of reassuring people that their choices are okay? If all choices are equally valid, and I think they are, then why do people see my hair and ask what brand of curlers to use, only to be afraid to use them? Why do they ask me about my lipstick and tell me they don't know how to find the right red, only to balk when I offer to help them find the right color for their skin tone and hue? The answer, I think, is that there's something else coloring our understanding of the situation. All of these activities and aesthetics that people admire in me are old-fashioned, and they stir up this feeling of nostalgia. Two kinds of nostalgia. First, we've got personal nostalgia. Now that's the basic building block. It relates to anything that we've lost within our lifetime that we can't get back. Maybe you're nostalgic for a belief in Santa Claus, or maybe you had a really good time at school and you like to think back fondly on it. I had a big hit of nostalgia a couple of years ago, right after the comic book store where I used to work closed down. I was visiting that town again, and I hadn't been back for a while, so when I walked down the main street and I saw the store, I went to see what was there, and it was a vape shop, and when I went in and checked it out, I saw that there was still the mural that I had talked with the artist about, and I'd watched him for weeks as he painted it, and underneath it there was a caption, "Thank you, Chapel Hill Comics," and I got nostalgic because I realized Chapel Hill Comics hadn't just moved, it wasn't somewhere else, everybody had moved on, and it was never coming back. But even though the shop was gone, Squirrel Girl and Doctor Strange were still fighting Galactus, and they were the only things left that weren't touched by money, time, and necessity. Memory and nostalgia are related, but they're not quite the same thing. Memory is the process by which we retain things. So once we have something stored away, if we use it again and again, eventually some details are going to be more perfectly remembered than others. For example, I have all of these really positive memories of work where I'm telling a story and I move a whole crowd of people, or I tell a joke and 50 people laugh at once, and that's such a good feeling. And then there are other things that I don't miss so much, like waking up at 5:25 5 days a week, which is just sort of objectively not as fun. Memory degrades over time, and so we might gloss over all the little hurdles and remember the big good stuff, and that's the point where memory starts to feel more like nostalgia. This probably goes without saying, but most of my friends are young enough that letter writing isn't exactly a skill that they cultivated. Maybe they had a pen pal when they were little, but they didn't learn how to write letters as if this was going to become their primary way of communicating with people. And so when they see me writing letters to my cousins, they don't have a personal nostalgia. This isn't something that they lost from their own life. Rather, it's a more general and cultural sense that something's been lost here. This sense comes from collective memory. Collective memory is a way of remembering something that didn't actually happen to you as if it happened to you. A common example of this is a group of people live through something traumatic together or impactful together. They live through it and they come back to each other and they talk about it and they share details, and maybe they come back together every year. And every time the story gets a little bit more cohesive, some of the rough edges get sanded off and sometimes the details get dropped or misattributed to somebody. It changes. But people generally accept this is how the story goes, and maybe they come to believe this new edited version. Well, years go by, they get married, they have kids, and the kids grow up hearing these stories too. Sometimes they hear their parents' version, sometimes they hear the full narrative, and because they've been hearing the stories their whole lives, they get this ingrained sense that this is part of them. They remember the story. And maybe their parents actually have to remind them, oh no, that actually happened years ago before you were born. But the kids still have this sense, this memory. That's cultural memory. Now, they probably know that this is an implanted memory, unlike their parents who have an edited memory that they may or may not know is a false memory. But it's important to them. It makes the group more whole. We're going to put a pin in this. Keep this idea in mind. We're coming back to it. Historical nostalgia is very similar to collective memory. The key here is that some things fade and other things leave you with a longing for the things that can't come back. Some people's historical nostalgia shows up in the form of admiring a previous generation. Maybe they admire the resourcefulness of people who lived through the Great Depression or the righteousness of those who fought in World War II. Other times people feel like they were born in the wrong generation. They say, I should have been a flower child, or 80s music was so much better, I should have been there. Nostalgia has a push and pull relationship with authenticity. It can't exist without it, but it also can't exist without extreme discrimination in the details. On a very basic level, bad things happen all the time. You can be nostalgic for the 80s, but you probably aren't nostalgic for wondering whether or not you can get AIDS from a toilet seat. I mean, that's horrible and scary and life-threatening. And so in order to be nostalgic for the 80s, you have to ignore things like that. Our ability to focus in on key details can even allow us to overlook whether something's real or fictional. A good example of this is the Louisa May Alcott house. Because even though she wrote about her family, Little Women is still a work of fiction and all the names are changed. So if you go into the house and you see Joe's room, well, it's not really Joe's room because Joe's made up, but it is Joe's real world corollary's room, and that's all very authentic. But we can push this even a step further. There's an attraction called Heidiland based on the book Heidi, and it has the real house where she grew up and the real farm and the way that they really milked the goats and all of these real things. And that's funny because Heidi was entirely fictional. There is no real Heidi land. There is no real Heidi. There never was, and yet people are able to overlook this and enjoy the nostalgia of what life in the old tiny Swiss Alps would have been like. It's not that people don't know it's a story, it's just that they're willing to overlook it in order to get that nostalgia hit. Just in case I haven't been entirely clear, historical nostalgia is not history. History is an academic discipline, and it's a little bit different from the past, and it's a little bit different from memory. There are some things that are undisputed as history, like documentary evidence or sometimes video and photo footage. Other things are disputed to one extent or another, things like psychology, literature, and oral histories. Finally, some things feel like history but aren't, and this includes historical nostalgia. What it is a longing for some perceived version of what used to be, and I don't know anywhere that breaks weirder than Gone with the Wind. If you follow me on Instagram, you know I read pretty widely. I read a lot of history, young adult, classic literature, anything to satisfy my curiosities, and there isn't a whole lot of literature that I shy away from. In fact, if I find myself shying away from something, I usually take that as an indication that I should approach it, see what it's all about, and evaluate for myself what the ideas are worth, if they're worth anything. I've read a lot of books like this, including Lolita, Mein Kampf, Embattled Rebel, and Gone with the Wind. Out of all of these books, I'm most nervous about telling people that I've read Gone with the Wind, because out of all of them, it's the most sticky and nostalgic, and it's the one that's most likely going to draw you in and feed you misinformation even without your knowing. With all of the talk about the book's content, I feel like the book's form doesn't really get that much discussion. It's a really well-written story. It's well-paced, the character development feels real, the stakes are high, and even though I know how the Siege of Atlanta ends, I still want these characters to be okay. When I say it's a good read, I don't mean it's a good read as a history. I mean it's a good read. For people who don't want to sit through a history book, this book is actually really full of details and history that will give you a flavor for the time. However, those details also make it easier for Margaret Mitchell to slip in her own fantasies about how she nostalgically thinks that the past may have been. Because she did so much work to make this feel like a world that could have existed, it makes it more difficult for someone who's not a trained historian to figure out exactly where things break from reality. For me, the nostalgia is most apparent in a scene in the second half of the book. At this point, Scarlett owns a lumber mill and she's contracting with different builders. Some of them are Yankees, and some of those Yankees brought their wives down south. As she rides to one of her building sites in her buggy, she's got a driver. As she rides to one of the building sites, she sees a couple of these Yankee women, and they say hello and they ask her for some advice on how to get a new servant. Their Irish serving girl had just given up on the south and moved back up north, and so they asked Scarlett, how do you find a good servant? And she says, well, down here, blacks are the servants. And she gives them some advice, and the Yankee women are appalled. They do not want a black person in their house. And so she says, well, our slaves are part of the family, and she rides off. But her driver confronts her about this later. He says, why didn't you defend me to those Yankee women? And she says, I did. I said you're part of the family. And he says, that's not defending me, that's just stating facts. The problem is that Uncle Peter's attitude doesn't reflect how newly freed people actually felt about being freed. I mean, people waited up in churches until midnight the day they were going to be free and then just left the plantation. When they saw Lincoln and Grant in town, they would flock to thank them. Like, these are people who are, by and large, very happy to not be servants and slaves anymore. Uncle Peter is not a representation of post-war black experience. What he is a puppet being played by a white lady in Atlanta 70 years along. And this, coincidentally, is the plot of Get Out, which is a better movie, and you should go watch that. As a comparison to Gone with the Wind, I'd like to now break down a scene from War and Peace. As Napoleon's forces push eastward, the most western territories of Russia start to pack up, move east,
and burn everything along the way, scorched earth policy. We meet Princess Maria right after her father has died in his home in Bald Hills, which is way far west, and so they're the first characters to have to pack up and move their whole territory. Her first move as the head of the household is to get all of her people, all of her serfs, all of her peasants off the land, to burn everything and to move further east. She's met with pushback from the peasants. They say that the French are willing to pay them many times for their grain what it would be worth at market, and they're not so sure about this whole Russia situation when being French would be far more profitable. So these peasants are putting the idea of being rational actors above the idea of being Russian. This was a surprise for me when I read it, because up to this point, we'd only had the point of view of the noble characters. These ideas of military and service and country were all that we had. But it also makes a lot of sense that the peasants wouldn't be overly committed if they weren't getting as much back from their country as their noble counterparts were. What's more is this scene shows that not everybody was having a good time, and this time period was imperfect, and that's the kind of thing that Gone with the Wind glosses over for the sake of nostalgia. The reason why Gone with the Wind still matters, or the reason why it still matters to me, is because people still know the story. People who visit the historic sites where I work are going to use it as a touch point for what kind of foods they ate, what kind of clothes they wore. Other people see it, internalize the racist nostalgia of it, and assume that they're going to see it. I have a good example of this from when I was working at Historic Stagville. I was trying to explain that sharecropping wasn't a path to financial success or personal advancement, but my audience heard me saying that slavery was better and that you're better off enslaved than you are as a sharecropper, which is not what I said. I didn't understand at the time how I'd been so badly misheard. I didn't understand at the time, and didn't until I really understood the kind of nostalgia that some whites have for the Old South, that I understood that he wasn't mishearing me so much as he was trying to connect dots that could have been there and trying to expose a prejudice that I definitely could have had, and I just happened not to. I may have been a little hard on nostalgia to this point. It really isn't just false memories and racism. There's a lot of positive good that can come from nostalgia. One of these things, if we want to take that little pin out that we put in at the very beginning, is community. You have cohesive memories with other people, and you understand things with them that other people outside of your little in-group, they just don't understand, and having that connection to other people can be a really good thing. Nostalgia can also be a very sensitive and intuitive way to look at the past to figure out what mattered about it. Don't get me wrong, you can obscure a lot of information with nostalgia, but it can also be used to pick up the fine details. For example, if you're nostalgic for the 80s, you're probably nostalgic for the music or the movies or the fashion. You might get really excited to watch It and Stranger Things because it brings back these good memories. Now, if you focus on these things, you might be blindsided by the fact that American pandemic response is to let people die. But I bet no gay man over 50 is surprised by the look pretty and do as little as possible approach. I was also willing to bet that no gay man over 50 would be nostalgic for the 80s, but when I did a little bit of research, I was proven wrong. As I read news articles and interviews, people spoke fondly of the communities that they built during that time, of knowing that if they got sick and they were in the hospital, they'd have people by their side, and of having a community of people to organize around. That's something that we're not allowed to have because this pandemic spreads so differently. It's so much more contagious. You cannot be in a room with your dying relatives because then you could get sick. So that's something, it's a little thing, and it's a thing that you would have to be very sensitive to in order to pick up on, but even that is something to be nostalgic for. So being able to pick up on the fine details, well, that's a really important tool. And then number 3 is the fact that if we can manufacture nostalgia, it actually gives us as a historian or as a documentarian another tool in our arsenal. And if we're talking about manufactured nostalgia, we've got to talk about Ken Burns. Ken Burns' Civil War series was released 30 years ago, has 8 national and international awards, and still has a 91% approval by its audiences. It's actually the thing that got me into history. I remember watching DVD after DVD on long car trips and being so drawn in by the music, by the photos, and by the overall feel that the story gave you. And yet it's panned by many historians, including Eric Foner, who wrote what many consider to be the definitive history of the Civil War. Foner writes, faced with a choice between historical illumination or nostalgia, Burns consistently opts for nostalgia. So it is a problem to consistently opt for nostalgia, but knowing that nostalgia is a good hook for audiences is really good news for museum professionals who are in the business of getting people to spend some of their precious leisure time at the museum. I'm gonna part the curtain here a little bit and let you guys in on an industry secret. We have a hard time knowing what museum visitors want. We've studied everything from how long people look at exhibit labels to the physical experience of being in a museum to how people engage with history on their own time. All of these different things have to come together for a really good museum experience, and yet we're still trying to figure out what's best practice. Eric Foner is not alone in worrying that nostalgia is the more powerful motivator in going to a historic museum or picking up a history book than illumination or insight. Yet these fears might be unfounded. Kellee, Caton, and Carla Santos published a study about how visitors engage with Route 66. They found that people's reason for coming wasn't purely nostalgic, and that people came away from the experience with all kinds of takeaways. People's experiences with past and history are going to differ, and people are going to want different things at different times. Instead of condemning nostalgia as ahistorical or coming to rely on it too heavily, it's important to understand nostalgia as a phenomenon. What can it do? What can't it do? And how do we use nostalgia? Thank you everybody for watching this video, and especially for those of you who have subscribed. If you know somebody who might be interested in this video in particular, or in the kinds of things that I do on this channel more generally, be sure to share with them. I am always happy to meet another history buff. As a more general note, I'm finally really happy with the kind of content that I'm creating. I feel like I've found my voice on this platform, and I'm ready to start growing. So give me a like, don't forget to comment down below, and again, if you know anybody who wants to know more about history, the historic process, or if you have any questions for me as a professional historian, please ask. I will do my best to answer, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. Until next time, make history.